Look around you and ask a dangerous question. Why are you always tired? Not tired from living fully, not tired from creating freely, but exhausted in your bones, in your mind, in your spirit. This exhaustion is not an accident, it is not a personal failure, it is a political condition. It is engineered. A system that feeds on your labor cannot allow you the strength to question it. A system built on exploitation must first drain the exploited. The ruling order survives not merely by chains and laws, but by fatigue. It keeps you too busy to think, too anxious to resist, too isolated to organize. It tells you this exhaustion is normal, that it is the price of survival, that struggle is individual and success is personal. In doing so, it hides the truth Marx laid bare long ago. Society is divided into classes, and the comfort of one is built upon the suffering of another. Under capitalism, labor is not life's expression but life's denial. The worker does not own what they produce, does not control how they work, does not decide the purpose of their effort. Labor becomes alienated, separated from the worker's humanity. Your time, your energy, your creativity are converted into commodities, bought as cheaply as possible and consumed until nothing remains but weariness. Exhaustion is profitable. A tired worker demands less. A tired mind obeys more easily. The capitalist does not need to crush you openly. He needs only to keep you running on a treadmill that never ends. Long hours, insecure wages, constant competition, fear of unemployment, these are not flaws of the system, they are its operating principles. The system must keep you exhausted because a rested worker might notice the theft occurring every day, surplus value extracted from their labor and accumulated in the hands of those who do not work. And when you collapse from this endless strain, the system whispers that the fault is yours. You did not work hard enough. You did not improve yourself enough. You did not compete ruthlessly enough. Thus, exploitation disguises itself as personal responsibility. Structural violence masquerades as individual weakness. Marx exposed this lie. The worker sells labor power not as an equal, but as one forced by necessity, stripped of alternatives, compelled to submit in order to live. Exhaustion also fragments the working class. When every worker is isolated in their struggle to survive, solidarity becomes difficult. When you are too tired to speak, too stressed to listen, too afraid to lose what little you have, collective action feels impossible. This is no coincidence. The bourgeois order thrives on division, worker against worker, nation against nation, identity against identity, while capital moves freely, accumulating power beyond borders and beyond accountability. The system tells you there is no alternative. It presents capitalism as eternal, natural, inevitable. But history exposes this as another illusion. Feudalism once claimed the same permanence, and it too fell when the exploited recognized their collective strength. Marx taught us that history is the history of class struggles, and every ruling system contains the seeds of its own destruction. Exhaustion is one of the ruling class's defenses against that historical truth. Consider how even rest is commodified. Sleep, leisure, recovery, these are no longer human needs but markets to be exploited. You are sold products to recover just enough to return to work, never enough to reclaim your life. The system does not want you broken beyond repair. It wants you functional, dependent, and replaceable. It needs you exhausted but not rebellious, alive but not awakened. Yet within this exhaustion lies a contradiction. The more the system drains the worker, the more it reveals its inhumanity. The more it demands, the more it exposes that it offers nothing but survival. At a certain point, weariness turns into awareness. Fatigue becomes a question. Why must life be this way? And that question is the beginning of revolt. Marx did not call for pity, he called for consciousness. Class consciousness is the moment when the worker understands that their suffering is not isolated, but shared, not accidental, but systemic, not eternal, but historically produced. When workers recognize themselves as a class, exhaustion ceases to be a private burden and becomes a political weapon. What the system uses to weaken you can become what unites you. The ruling class fears nothing more than organized, conscious workers, not exhausted individuals, but a collective that understands its power. For all wealth is produced by labor. Every machine, every city, Every fortune is the crystallized labor of the working class. Capital owns nothing without labor's consent, and that consent is maintained through necessity, fear, and fatigue. To reclaim your humanity is not merely to demand higher wages or shorter hours, though these struggles matter. It is to challenge the very logic that reduces human life to profit. It is to refuse a system that values commodities more than people, accumulation more than dignity, growth more than freedom. True emancipation requires the abolition of exploitation itself, not its polite reform. The system needs you exhausted because a liberated worker is dangerous. A worker who rests, thinks, studies, and organizes threatens the foundations of capital. A worker who sees through ideology cannot be ruled by slogans. A worker who stands with others cannot be so easily disciplined. This is why every movement toward collective power is met with repression, ridicule, or co-optation. But history does not move by permission, it moves by struggle. And struggle begins when the oppressed refuse to accept exhaustion as destiny. When they transform fatigue into fury, despair into discipline, isolation into solidarity. When they recognize that the chains they wear are not personal failures but social relations that can be broken. You are not exhausted because you are weak. You are exhausted because you are exploited, and exploitation is not a law of nature, it is a human construction that can be dismantled by human action. The future belongs not to those who profit from exhaustion, but to those who end it. Workers of the world, you have been drained long enough. You have nothing to lose but your exhaustion and a world to win. Exhaustion is not an accident of modern life, nor is it the result of individual weakness, poor choices, or lack of discipline. It is a social condition produced by a system that depends on the constant extraction of human energy for profit. Capitalism does not merely use labor, it consumes it. It organizes society in such a way that the majority must sell their time, strength, and mental capacity simply to survive, while a minority accumulates wealth from that sale. In this arrangement, exhaustion becomes a requirement. A worker who is always tired is less likely to question, resist, or imagine a different way of living. The system presents exhaustion as normal and unavoidable. Long working hours, multiple jobs, unstable income, rising living costs, and constant pressure to remain productive are treated as facts of life rather than political outcomes. From an early age, people are trained to accept fatigue as virtue. Being busy is praised, rest is treated as laziness, and burnout is reframed as ambition taken too far. This moralization of exhaustion hides its real function. When workers internalize blame for their fatigue, they stop looking outward at the structure that produces it. Guilt replaces anger, and self-criticism replaces class consciousness. Marx exposed how labor under capitalism becomes alienated. The worker does not control the pace, purpose, or product of their work. Their labor power is purchased like any other commodity, used to generate value far beyond what they are paid, and discarded when it no longer serves profitability. This process necessarily drains the worker. The extraction of surplus value is not only economic, it is physical and psychological. Time that could be used for rest, education, creativity, or collective life is absorbed by work or by recovering just enough to work again. Exhaustion is built into the cycle of production itself. The system requires workers to remain in a state of constant insecurity. Fear of unemployment, debt, and social exclusion forces people to accept conditions that damage their health and dignity. Exhaustion weakens resistance because it narrows the horizon of possibility. When survival consumes all energy, systemic critique feels like a luxury. The worker is pushed into a permanent present, focused only on getting through the day, paying the next bill, meeting the next demand. In this state, exploitation reproduces itself quietly, without the need for overt repression. Capitalist ideology reinforces this by promoting the myth of individual responsibility. Success and failure are portrayed as personal outcomes rather than social relations. If you are exhausted, it is because you did not manage your time well, did not improve your skills, did not optimize yourself enough. This narrative isolates workers from one another. Each person experiences exhaustion privately, believing it to be a personal shortcoming, unaware that millions share the same condition. The collective nature of exploitation is concealed behind the language of self-help and personal development. Even rest is carefully controlled. The system allows only the amount of recovery necessary to maintain productivity. Leisure is commodified, scheduled, and sold back to workers as entertainment, wellness products, or short escapes that never challenge the underlying structure. True rest, the kind that restores autonomy and critical thought, is discouraged. A well-rested worker might begin to notice contradictions, to ask why so much labor produces so little security, why abundance exists alongside deprivation, why those who work the least often possess the most. Exhaustion also plays a crucial role in suppressing solidarity. Organizing requires time, energy, and trust. When workers are stretched thin, collective action becomes difficult to sustain. Meetings are missed, movements lose momentum, and struggles are postponed indefinitely. This fragmentation benefits capital, which thrives when workers are divided and overwhelmed. The system does not need absolute obedience. It needs only enough fatigue to prevent sustained resistance. Yet exhaustion contains within it the potential for awakening. When workers begin to recognize that their tiredness is shared, patterned, and produced by the same economic forces, the personal transforms into the political. What once felt like individual failure is revealed as a social injury. This recognition undermines the ideology that sustains exploitation. It opens the possibility of solidarity, of organizing not merely for better conditions within the system, but against the logic that demands exhaustion in the first place. To name exhaustion as a tool of capitalist control is to reclaim dignity from blame. It is to understand that fatigue is not a sign of weakness, but evidence of being exploited. This understanding challenges the moral order of capitalism, which depends on turning suffering into virtue and endurance into obedience. When workers reject this narrative, they begin to see rest, resistance, and collective struggle not as indulgences, but as necessary acts of survival within a system that profits from their depletion. Capitalism survives not because it creates harmony or fulfills human needs, but because it systematically extracts surplus value from labor while severing workers from any meaningful connection to what they produce. Marx revealed that profit is not born from exchange or innovation alone, but from unpaid labor. The worker sells labor power for a wage that covers only a fraction of the value they create. The remainder, the surplus value, is appropriated by the capitalist as profit. This hidden theft is the foundation upon which the entire system stands, and it requires a specific social arrangement in which workers are separated from ownership, control, and purpose. Under capitalism, labor is transformed from a human activity into a means of survival. Work is no longer the expression of creative capacity or social contribution, but an external force imposed upon the worker. The labor process is organized not around human fulfillment, but around efficiency, accumulation, and profit maximization. Workers do not decide what is produced, how it is produced, or why it is produced. These decisions are monopolized by those who own the means of production. As a result, the worker's activity becomes something alien, something performed under compulsion rather than choice. This alienation operates on multiple levels. The worker is alienated from the product of labor, which belongs not to the one who created it, but to the capitalist who sells it. The worker may spend hours, years, or an entire lifetime producing goods or services they cannot afford, do not control, and may not even believe in. What should be a source of pride becomes a reminder of powerlessness. The product confronts the worker as something foreign, even hostile, embodying the wealth and power of another class. The worker is also alienated from the act of labor itself. Work becomes repetitive, fragmented, and mechanical, stripped of autonomy and meaning. The worker follows instructions, meets quotas, and submits to schedules designed to extract the maximum amount of labor in the minimum amount of time. Creativity is discouraged unless it serves productivity. The body and mind are disciplined to function as instruments of profit. Labor ceases to be a conscious, self-directed activity and becomes a burden endured for the sake of wages. This alienation extends to the worker's own humanity. When labor dominates life, leaving little time or energy for rest, reflection, or social connection, human potential is stunted. The worker is reduced to a role valued only for productivity. Emotional, intellectual, and communal dimensions of life are subordinated to economic necessity. People begin to experience themselves not as full human beings, but as resources to be managed, optimized, and exhausted. This dehumanization is not incidental. It is essential to maintaining a system that treats labor as a commodity. Capitalism also alienates workers from one another. Instead of cooperating as members of a collective class with shared interests, workers are placed in competition. Jobs are scarce, wages are suppressed, and insecurity is constant. Each worker is encouraged to see others as rivals rather than allies. This competition weakens solidarity and obscures the real source of exploitation. While workers struggle against one another for survival, capital accumulates quietly, benefiting from division and distrust. The extraction of surplus value depends on this alienation. A worker who feels connected to their labor, who understands its social value and their collective power, is less likely to accept exploitation. Alienation dulls awareness and normalizes inequality. When workers feel disconnected from the products of their labor and from each other, exploitation appears abstract, inevitable, or invisible. Profit seems to arise naturally, rather than from stolen labor time. Ideology plays a crucial role in sustaining this process. Capitalism presents itself as fair, meritocratic, and efficient. Wages are framed as equal exchange, masking the reality that workers are paid less than the value they produce. Success is attributed to individual effort, while poverty and precarity are blamed on personal failure. This narrative reinforces alienation by preventing workers from recognizing their shared condition and common interests. Technology, rather than liberating workers, is often used to deepen alienation. Machines and digital systems increase productivity, but the benefits flow upward. Workers are monitored, measured, and accelerated, while decisions remain centralized in the hands of capital. The promise that technological progress would reduce labor time is betrayed by a system that uses efficiency to intensify exploitation rather than to free human life from unnecessary toil. Capitalism cannot survive without this separation between workers and their labor. If workers collectively controlled production, surplus value would no longer be privately appropriated. If labor were organized around human needs rather than profit, exploitation would lose its justification. Alienation is therefore not a side effect, but a structural necessity. It ensures that workers continue to produce wealth they do not own, under conditions they do not control, for purposes that do not serve them, sustaining a system that presents this arrangement as natural while reproducing inequality through every working day. Fatigue is not merely a physical condition, but a social weapon that fragments the working class and undermines its capacity for collective resistance. When workers are constantly drained by long hours, low wages, and perpetual insecurity, their ability to connect with one another is systematically weakened. Capitalism depends on this exhaustion because unity requires energy, time, and mental clarity. A fatigued population is easier to manage, easier to divide, and far less likely to recognize its shared interests or act upon them. The working class is strongest when it understands itself as a collective force, yet fatigue pushes workers inward, trapping them within their own private struggles. When survival becomes the primary concern, broader social questions are pushed aside. Workers focus on immediate needs, paying rent, feeding families, avoiding unemployment, leaving little space for political engagement or long-term organizing. This constant pressure narrows vision and shortens attention, making systemic critique feel distant and impractical. In such conditions, isolation replaces solidarity, and endurance replaces resistance. Capitalism structures work in a way that ensures this fragmentation. Irregular schedules, multiple jobs, gig work, and precarious contracts prevent workers from forming stable relationships with one another. Colleagues change constantly, workplaces become temporary, and shared experiences are disrupted. Without consistent interaction, trust is difficult to build. Fatigue deepens this instability by leaving workers with neither the time nor the energy to cultivate collective bonds. Even when workers recognize injustice, exhaustion often silences them before they can act. Fatigue also reshapes consciousness. A tired worker is less likely to engage critically with ideology, less likely to question dominant narratives, and more likely to accept existing conditions as inevitable. The mental strain of exhaustion dulls curiosity and suppresses imagination. The system benefits from this intellectual depletion because resistance begins with thought. When workers are too drained to read, discuss, or reflect, the ruling ideas of society remain unchallenged. The absence of critical engagement allows exploitation to reproduce itself quietly, day after day. The fragmentation caused by fatigue is reinforced by competition. Capitalism encourages workers to compete for scarce opportunities, promotions, and job security. This competition intensifies exhaustion while simultaneously turning workers against one another. Instead of seeing shared exploitation, workers are encouraged to see rivals. Fatigue amplifies resentment and mistrust, making cooperation harder. Collective resistance requires patience, empathy, and coordination, all of which are eroded by constant strain and stress. Historical struggles of the working class demonstrate that organization demands sustained effort. Strikes, unions, and movements are not spontaneous events, but the result of ongoing coordination and mutual support. Fatigue disrupts this process by breaking continuity. Meetings are postponed, participation declines, and momentum fades. Capital does not need to defeat movements directly. It can simply wait for exhaustion to do its work. Time, when controlled by capital, becomes a counter-revolutionary force. Even spaces meant for rest often fail to restore collective strength. Leisure under capitalism is individualized and commodified, designed to distract rather than connect. Entertainment replaces conversation, consumption replaces community. Workers recover just enough to return to work, but not enough to rebuild solidarity. The system allows recovery only to the extent that it sustains productivity, not resistance. True rest, which fosters reflection and collective awareness, remains inaccessible to many. Fatigue also distorts emotional life. Chronic exhaustion breeds frustration, apathy, and despair. These emotions can be turned inward, leading workers to blame themselves for conditions imposed upon them. When people feel overwhelmed, they are more likely to withdraw than to organize. This emotional withdrawal further fragments the working class, as shared anger is replaced by private suffering. The system thrives when pain is experienced individually rather than collectively. Yet fatigue is not evenly distributed. Certain groups within the working class are subjected to even greater exhaustion due to race, gender, migration status, or informal employment. This unevenness creates additional divisions, which capital exploits. Instead of recognizing these differences as outcomes of the same system, workers are encouraged to see them as separate struggles. Fatigue makes it harder to see how these experiences intersect, weakening the possibility of unified resistance. Despite this, fatigue also reveals the system's vulnerability. The very fact that capital must exhaust workers to survive exposes its dependence on their labor. When workers begin to recognize that their fatigue is shared and structured, fragmentation can give way to awareness. The recognition that exhaustion is not personal but political opens the door to solidarity. The challenge lies in transforming depleted lives into organized resistance, in reclaiming time and energy from a system that consumes them to prevent collective power from emerging. Class consciousness emerges when workers begin to understand that their exhaustion is not an individual burden but a shared condition produced by a common system. What capitalism isolates and privatizes, class consciousness reunites and politicizes. Fatigue, when experienced alone, breeds silence and resignation. But when recognized collectively, it becomes evidence of exploitation. This recognition marks a decisive shift from endurance to awareness, from suffering in isolation to understanding oneself as part of a class with shared interests and shared power. Under capitalism, exhaustion is lived privately. Each worker believes their tiredness is unique, caused by personal circumstances, poor decisions, or personal inadequacy. Class consciousness breaks this illusion by revealing the social roots of fatigue. Workers begin to see that long hours, low wages, job insecurity, and constant pressure are not random hardships but systematic outcomes of capitalist production. This shared recognition dissolves guilt and replaces it with clarity. What once felt like failure is exposed as exploitation, and this exposure is profoundly transformative. When workers recognize that their exhaustion is common, they begin to recognize one another. Isolation weakens when individuals see their own condition reflected in others. Conversations change in tone and purpose, complaints become analyses, frustrations become questions, and questions become demands. Class consciousness turns private pain into collective knowledge. It provides language to name exploitation and frameworks to understand it, allowing workers to locate their suffering within a broader social structure rather than within themselves. This transformation is not merely intellectual, it is practical. Awareness alone does not dismantle exploitation, but it creates the conditions for organization. When workers understand that their exhaustion is produced by the same system, cooperation becomes logical rather than idealistic. Solidarity is no longer based on charity or sympathy, but on material interest. Workers recognize that what harms one harms all, and what strengthens one strengthens the collective. This realization lays the groundwork for unions, movements, and coordinated resistance. Class consciousness also reshapes time. Exhaustion traps workers in the immediate present, focused only on survival. Consciousness restores historical perspective. Workers begin to see themselves as part of an ongoing struggle that predates them and will outlast them. This historical awareness counters the capitalist narrative that presents the current order as permanent and unchangeable. When workers understand that systems are made by humans and can be unmade by humans, exhaustion loses its power to paralyze. Organized power arises when shared exhaustion is channeled into collective action. Strikes, protests, and movements are not born from comfort but from limits. When workers collectively recognize that they can no longer endure existing conditions, exhaustion becomes a catalyst rather than an obstacle. Class consciousness provides direction to this energy, preventing it from dissipating into despair or individual escape. It turns raw fatigue into disciplined resistance. Capitalism fears this transformation because organized workers threaten its foundations. A conscious working class understands that all wealth originates from labor and that capital depends entirely on workers' participation. When workers act collectively, they can interrupt production, disrupt accumulation, and challenge authority. Exhaustion, once used to weaken resistance, becomes proof of labor's centrality. The system's reliance on fatigue exposes its vulnerability. Class consciousness also counters the divisions that capital relies upon. Differences of occupation, identity, and geography are real, but class consciousness reveals how these differences are structured by the same economic relations. Shared exhaustion becomes a bridge rather than a barrier. Workers begin to see that while their experiences may differ in form, they are united in substance. This understanding strengthens collective power by expanding solidarity beyond narrow boundaries. The transformation of exhaustion into organized power requires sustained effort. Consciousness must be nurtured through education, discussion, and collective practice. Capital constantly works to reverse this process, promoting individualism, competition, and distraction. Yet each act of solidarity reinforces awareness. Each shared struggle deepens understanding. Each moment of collective resistance weakens the ideology that sustains exploitation. Class consciousness does not eliminate exhaustion immediately, but it changes its meaning. Fatigue ceases to be merely something to endure and becomes something to confront. Workers begin to demand not just relief from exhaustion, but control over the conditions that produce it. They challenge the logic that treats human energy as an infinite resource for profit. Through organization, they reclaim time, dignity, and agency from a system that thrives on their depletion. In this transformation, exhaustion becomes a source of power rather than weakness. When workers recognize that their fatigue is shared, structured, and unnecessary, they begin to see that the system exhausting them is neither natural nor invincible. Organized awareness converts weariness into resolve, and resolve into collective action, revealing that the very condition meant to keep workers passive can become the force that unites them against the system that depends on their exhaustion. Emancipation cannot be achieved by adjusting the surface of a system built on exploitation, because exploitation is not a defect within capitalism but its very foundation. To reform exploitation is to accept its legitimacy, to merely negotiate the terms under which it continues. Marx made clear that as long as one class owns the means of production and another is forced to sell labor power to survive, domination persists regardless of how humane it appears. True emancipation demands the abolition of these relations themselves, not their moderation. Capitalism presents reform as progress. Higher wages, limited protections, and regulated working hours are offered as solutions, yet these concessions leave the core structure intact. The worker still produces more value than they receive. Surplus value is still extracted. Labor remains alienated. Reform does not end exploitation, it stabilizes it. By softening the most visible harms, reform prolongs the system's life while preserving its essential injustice. It teaches workers to hope for relief rather than transformation, to seek comfort rather than control. Exploitation is not simply low pay or harsh conditions, it is the systematic appropriation of unpaid labor. Even under the most regulated capitalism, profit depends on extracting more value from workers than is returned to them. As long as this mechanism operates, inequality is reproduced continuously. Wealth accumulates on one side, insecurity on the other. No reform can change this without challenging private ownership of production itself. To leave ownership untouched is to leave power untouched. Reform also obscures the nature of domination by framing it as negotiable. When exploitation is treated as a problem of excess rather than structure, resistance is redirected into endless compromise. Workers are encouraged to believe that justice can be achieved within a system that requires their subordination. This belief weakens revolutionary consciousness by shifting struggle from abolition to adjustment. The system appears flexible, reasonable, and responsive, even as it continues to extract labor and concentrate power. Marx understood that exploitation shapes not only economics but consciousness. A system that commodifies labor also commodifies time, relationships, and human potential. Reform may ease certain pressures, but it does not restore control over life itself. Workers remain dependent on wages, subject to market forces, and vulnerable to crisis. Their survival continues to hinge on forces beyond their control. Emancipation cannot coexist with dependency, and reform does not eliminate dependency. History shows that reforms are often granted not out of benevolence but out of fear. They are concessions made to preserve order when resistance threatens stability. Once pressure subsides, reforms are rolled back, diluted, or rendered meaningless. Capitalism tolerates reform because it does not threaten ownership. It resists abolition because abolition challenges the right of one class to live off the labor of another. Reform manages conflict. Abolition resolves it by transforming the underlying relations. The promise of reform also fragments struggle. Some workers benefit temporarily, others are excluded, and divisions deepen. Reform is uneven, selective, and reversible. Abolition, by contrast, addresses exploitation at its root. It seeks to reorganize production around collective ownership and democratic control, eliminating the conditions that produce inequality rather than redistributing its outcomes. This is not an abstract ideal, but a material necessity if exploitation is to end, rather than change form. Capitalism can absorb reforms because it is adaptable. It can incorporate regulations, welfare systems, and social programs while maintaining exploitation through new mechanisms. Global supply chains, financialization, and technological control extend exploitation beyond traditional workplaces. Reform that focuses only on symptoms cannot confront these evolving forms. Abolition targets the logic driving them all: profit derived from unpaid labor. Emancipation requires breaking with the idea that exploitation can be managed ethically. It requires rejecting the notion that a system built on domination can be made just through adjustment. Marx's critique insists that freedom is not compatible with relations where one class commands labor and another obeys. Liberation demands a society in which producers collectively control production, where labor serves human needs rather than capital accumulation. This transformation is not immediate or effortless. It requires organization, struggle, and sustained collective action. Reform without abolition leads to stagnation, while abolition without struggle remains impossible. The path to emancipation lies not in perfecting exploitation but in ending it, not in negotiating domination but in dismantling it, not in humanizing a system that thrives on inequality but in replacing it with one that makes exploitation structurally impossible, where social wealth is collectively created and collectively owned, where labor is no longer a means of survival under compulsion but a conscious activity directed by those who perform it, where freedom is not granted by the system but produced through the destruction of the conditions that made exploitation necessary. The truth that emerges from this struggle is unmistakable. The system survives by draining life from those who sustain it. Exhaustion is imposed to prevent awareness. Alienation is enforced to conceal theft, and fragmentation is maintained to block solidarity. Yet within these conditions lies the force capable of overturning them. When workers recognize that their fatigue is shared, that their labor is exploited, and that their suffering is structural rather than personal, a transformation begins. Class consciousness turns weariness into clarity and clarity into power. The future does not belong to a system that requires human depletion to function. It belongs to those who refuse to accept exhaustion as destiny and exploitation as natural law. Emancipation will not come through minor adjustments or temporary relief, but through collective action that dismantles the relations of domination at their root. History advances when the oppressed organize, reclaim control over their labor, and assert their right to live as full human beings rather than instruments of profit. The task is urgent, but the power already exists. It exists in the hands that produce all wealth, in the minds that awaken to shared truth, and in the collective will that no system can exhaust forever. When workers rise together, the machinery that feeds on their fatigue grinds to a halt, and a new social order becomes not only possible, but inevitable.